The wind, a relentless sculptor of the land, howled a mournful tune across the vast, unforgiving plains of the American West. It was a sound Elias knew intimately, a constant, often chilling companion in his solitary life. He sat hunched by the crackling campfire, its meager warmth a stark, almost defiant contrast to the biting cold of the late autumn night. Rain, thick and relentless, hammered against the canvas of his small tent, a drumbeat turning the dry, cracked earth into a slick, muddy quagmire. Inside, Jed, his taciturn partner, was already lost to sleep, a low, rumbling snore escaping his weathered lips. They were but two fragile specks of humanity in an ocean of wilderness, their days a monotonous cycle of cattle, dust, and the profound, isolating silence that defined their existence. Elias stirred his coffee, the bitter, comforting aroma cutting through the damp, earthy air. His gaze, weary and distant, drifted towards the flickering shadows dancing beyond the firelight. He'd seen enough storms to know this one was particularly nasty, the kind that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful, erasing all trace. He pulled his woolen blanket tighter around his shoulders, a shiver running down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold, a premonition perhaps. Suddenly, a flicker of movement, something substantial and dark, caught his eye at the very edge of the storm-lashed darkness. It wasn't the swaying of the sparse prairie grass or the ghostly shimmer of rain on a distant rock. He squinted, his hand instinctively reaching for the worn Colt, .45 holstered at his hip, its familiar weight a cold comfort. Ghosts of past encounters, of distant war cries and grim warnings about hostiles flashed through his mind, quick as lightning. But this wasn't the hulking silhouette of a lone, armed rider, nor the stealthy approach of a famished coyote. There were more than one. Slowly, cautiously, 7 figures emerged from the driving, blinding rain, their forms barely discernible against the inky blackness that clung to the horizon. They were women, wrapped in tattered, waterlogged blankets that clung to their frames, their faces etched with a profound weariness that transcended the elements. Sioux women. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in his chest. He'd heard the stories whispered around town, seen the wary, often fearful glances of settlers when the Sioux were mentioned. They were cast as enemies, shadows on the very land he sought to tame. Yet there was no aggression in their stance, no hint of a threat, only a desperate, raw vulnerability that cut through his ingrained fear and prejudice. Their eyes, dark and searching, met his across the rain-swept clearing, pleading in a language beyond words. He saw not aggression, but hunger, the deep gnaw of cold, and a raw, unyielding exhaustion that seemed to weigh them down. One woman, older than the others, her face a roadmap of hard-won experience, held a small child clutched fiercely to her chest, its tiny, rasping coughs barely audible over the relentless roar of the storm. Jed, roused by the sudden, palpable shift in atmosphere, grunted loudly from inside the tent. "What in tarnation?" he mumbled, his voice rough with sleep and suspicion. He stumbled out, blinking against the firelight, his own hand going to his Winchester rifle, its cold metal a stark contrast to the damp air. Elias, despite his own trepidation, held up a hand, a silent but firm command for Jed to hold his fire. He looked at the bedraggled women, then back at the sputtering fire, at the meager food supplies they had carefully rationed. His mind raced, a whirlwind of suspicion battling with an unfamiliar nascent stir of something akin to pity. They were clearly defenseless, clearly stranded, and the storm showed no signs of relenting its icy embrace. The older woman, her gaze fixed on the life-giving flames, took a hesitant, almost tentative step forward. She made a simple, universal gesture, rubbing her arms as if warding off the bitter chill. Elias hesitated for a long moment, then, with a slow, almost imperceptible nod, gestured towards the warmth of the fire. The women, as if on cue, shuffled closer, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes wary but hopeful, never leaving the two men. The child whimpered again, a small, fragile sound that pierced the heavy tension, a stark reminder of their shared humanity. Elias glanced at Jed, who stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, ingrained suspicion, and a hint of bewildered confusion. Their silent agreement, their comfortable, self-imposed solitude, had been shattered irrevocably. The storm had brought them not just torrents of rain, but an impossible, unexpected dilemma. And as the women huddled closer to the fire, their shivering forms casting long, wavering shadows across the wet ground, Elias knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the rain, that their quiet lives were about to change forever. This wasn't just another storm, it was a profound, undeniable turning point. Don't miss out on this unfolding story. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can follow Elias and Jed's journey through the challenges of the Old West. The night stretched on, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from ceaseless rain and an almost unbearable unease. The Sioux women, their faces shadowed by the firelight, huddled together, their wet clothes steaming faintly as the heat began to draw out the moisture. Their eyes, though less frantic, occasionally darted towards Elias and Jed, a silent, watchful apprehension. The two ranchers sat rigidly opposite them, rifles propped within easy reach against their knees, a silent, palpable barrier of ingrained mistrust separating the two disparate groups. Sleep was a distant, unattainable luxury. Every rustle of the wind against the canvas, every drip of water from the tent flap, seemed amplified in the pre-dawn quiet, turning the small, crowded camp into a crucible of unspoken tension and raw survival. Elias, despite his own exhaustion, found himself unable to tear his gaze from the women. Their faces, even in the dim, flickering light, showed undeniable signs of profound hardship. A network of fine cuts, fading bruises, and the hollows beneath their cheekbones that spoke of prolonged hunger. The young child, a girl no older than 3, lay curled protectively against the older woman, who Elias now recognized as the matriarch of the group. Her face, a tapestry of deep lines, betrayed a lifetime of both wisdom and profound sorrow. With a deep sigh, Elias finally reached into their dwindling provisions and offered them some strips of dried jerky and a few pieces of hardtack. The women ate slowly, deliberately, their hunger evident in their measured, almost reverent bites, but also in the quiet dignity with which they accepted the offering. No words were exchanged, only a shared, desperate need for warmth and sustenance, a primal understanding. Jed, less observant and certainly less empathetic than Elias, simply glared across the fire, his suspicion a palpable, almost suffocating force. He'd seen too much of the West's unsparing cruelty, too many broken treaties and violent encounters to trust easily, especially not a group of Sioux, traditionally seen as adversaries, hostiles. Yet even his hardened gaze couldn't deny the profound vulnerability before them. They were clearly not a war party, not a raiding band. They were simply survivors, desperate and alone. As dawn slowly approached, painting the eastern sky in bruised purples and greys like a fading bruise, the rain finally began to subside, leaving the landscape a muddy, glistening expanse under a low, heavy sky. The camp was a mess of damp blankets, trampled earth, and lingering ashes. The tension, however, remained, thick and unyielding. The women looked at Elias expectantly, a silent, weighty question in their dark eyes. What now? The storm had passed, but the storm within their circumstances raged on. With the first hesitant rays of light slicing through the heavy cloud cover, the older woman, whose name Elias had gleaned was Wing Yang Waste, good woman, finally spoke. Her voice, though soft and raspy from disuse and cold, was clear enough as she gestured vaguely eastward. Wagon, broken, many sons, walking. Her words were slow, heavy with effort and profound exhaustion, painting a stark picture of a desperate, arduous journey. They had been separated from their band, their wagon breaking down in a remote, forgotten valley, forcing them to abandon it and walk for what felt like endless days, hoping against hope to find help, to find safety. Elias exchanged a weary glance with Jed, who merely grunted, his face still a mask of stoic reluctance. A broken wagon meant they weren't going anywhere fast. It also meant an unwelcome, unforeseen responsibility had fallen upon them, a heavy burden in their carefully constructed, solitary lives. Jed finally voiced his frustration, his voice low and gruff. "Ain't our problem, Elias. They can move on their own. We got cattle to tend." But Elias, looking again at the exhausted women, particularly the frail, shivering child, knew better. They wouldn't survive long on their own in this unforgiving wilderness, not with winter's icy breath already on the wind. The vastness of the plains, even in fair weather, could swallow the unprepared whole. He sighed, the weight of an unavoidable decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. "We can take 'em to the nearest settlement," he finally said, his voice gruff, betraying little of the internal debate. "But it's a long ride, Jed, a damn long ride." Wingyang Waste's eyes, which had held so much despair, brightened perceptibly, a spark of resilient hope replacing the weary emptiness. She nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of his words. The journey, however, would be fraught with immediate challenges. Their meager supplies, carefully portioned for 2 men, were wholly inadequate for 9, and the trails, even the well-worn ones, were treacherous, especially after the recent torrential rains, which had turned them into slick, muddy traps. They were embarking on a journey not just across physical miles, but across vast cultural divides. The journey began with an uneasy, unspoken truce. Elias and Jed rode ahead, their figures silhouetted against the vast expanse, scouting the winding path, their rifles at the ready, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The women followed on foot, surprisingly resilient despite their weakened state, their steps quiet and steady. The young child, named Changte Wingyang, Heart Woman, was carried by her mother Sichangu Wingyang, Bruised Woman, a younger woman with fierce, protective eyes and a quiet dignity that belied her hardship. Days blended into one another, marked only by the relentless rising and setting sun and the constant grueling struggle against the elements. They rationed food with meticulous care, each portion a precious commodity. They shared their limited water, the precious liquid a moment of respite from the dust and dry air. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to learn to communicate through a rudimentary language of gestures and the few shared broken words they each knew. Jed remained stubbornly distant, his interactions with the women minimal, his face a constant mask of gruff indifference. Yet Elias noticed subtle shifts. Jed would subtly ensure they didn't fall too far behind or leave a small piece of dried meat where one of the women would find it. Elias, on the other hand, found his own hardened exterior slowly softening. He began to see not abstract enemies or natives, but fellow human beings, simply survivors. He listened through Wingyang Waste's halting words of their village, of their people's desperate struggle against the encroaching settlers, and the devastating illness that had recently swept through their people, leaving a trail of sorrow and empty lodges. One evening, by a small, sputtering campfire, barely holding back the encroaching chill, a sudden, sharp crack from the darkness splintered the uneasy quiet. They were ambushed by a small, ragged band of renegade cowboys, drawn by the faint smoke and the promise of easy pickings. The cowboys, rough and opportunistic, saw only defenseless women and isolated men, ripe for plunder. Jed, without a word, his face suddenly grim and determined, drew his rifle, taking aim. Elias, quick to follow, fired a warning shot that echoed sharply across the desolate land. The ensuing skirmish was brief but fierce, a flurry of shouts and gunshots. Elias and Jed, despite their reluctance, fought together with a primal ferocity, a united front protecting the women. They drove off the cowboys, who scattered into the darkness, but not without consequences. One of the Sioux women, Tate Wingyang, Wind Woman, cried out, clutching her arm where a stray bullet had grazed her, leaving a deep, bleeding gash. Elias, despite his lack of medical experience beyond patching up ranch hands, quickly cleaned and bandaged the wound with what little clean cloth and medicinal herbs he carried. Wingyang Waist watched him, her gaze a mixture of profound gratitude and genuine surprise. The fight had undeniably forged a fragile, unspoken bond between them, a sudden, stark recognition of shared vulnerability and mutual dependence. It was no longer just about their own survival, it was about protecting each other. As the first faint stars emerged above them, piercing the vast, inky canvas of the night sky, Elias felt a profound shift within himself. The silence that had once defined his solitary life was slowly, irrevocably, being filled by something new, something entirely unexpected, yet profoundly real. You're halfway through this compelling journey. To keep up with Elias, Jed, and the Sioux women as their story unfolds, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The incident with the renegade cowboys had a profound and unexpected effect on the group dynamic. The Sioux women, who had until then maintained a respectful, almost wary distance, began to relax slightly, their eyes holding less apprehension and more attentive curiosity. Jed, surprisingly, showed a grudging, almost imperceptible respect for their quiet resilience and resourcefulness. He even started offering the child, Changte Wingyang, small pieces of dried fruit from his own limited stash, a simple gesture that spoke volumes where words failed. As they continued their arduous trek, the landscape became increasingly rugged, challenging their physical endurance with every step. They traversed rocky hills, their horses struggling for purchase, navigated narrow, shadowed ravines where the wind whistled eerie tunes, and crossed shallow, icy rivers whose frigid waters numbed their feet. The weather remained stubbornly unpredictable, swinging between cold, clear days, where the distant mountains stood sharp against the sky, and sudden, biting winds that promised winter's swift, unforgiving arrival. Food was desperately scarce, and Elias and Jed spent more time hunting, their practiced skills providing just enough meager sustenance to keep everyone going, a fragile balance between life and starvation. During these hunting forays, Elias often found himself walking alongside Wichapi Wingyang, Star Woman, a younger woman with a quiet strength in her movements and a keen, almost uncanny eye for tracks in the dusty earth. Through broken words and a tapestry of gestures, she shared fragmented stories of her people, of their deep, almost sacred connection to the vast living land and the ancient traditions that sustained them through generations. Elias, in turn, spoke of his own life as a rancher, the endless back-breaking work, the loneliness that was a constant gnawing companion, and the dreams that spurred him on. Slowly, imperceptibly, a fragile understanding began to bridge the vast cultural gap between their two worlds, built on shared experiences and mutual respect. Just as they thought they were finally nearing a familiar, more traveled trail, their progress was abruptly halted by a formidable obstacle, a swollen river, its waters raging and churning from recent snowmelt in the distant snow-capped mountains. It was too deep and far too fast to cross safely on foot, its current a swirling, powerful beast. Their only option was to find a shallower, calmer ford, which meant a frustrating detour of several days, pushing their already dwindling supplies to the absolute breaking point. Frustration simmered, a bitter undertow beneath the surface, particularly from Jed, whose gruff patience was clearly wearing thin. "This is a waste of time, Elias," he grumbled, his voice low and tight with suppressed anger. "We should have left them to their own kind. We're losing good days." Elias merely shook his head, his own jaw tight with determination. "We're in it now, Jed," he responded, his voice equally firm. "We finish what we started. There's no turning back." He knew the profound dangers of the raging river. One wrong step, one lapse in judgment, could mean drowning, could mean the end for any of them. They spent a tense, exhausting day scouting, searching desperately for the safest crossing point, their eyes constantly scanning the treacherous currents. The women, despite their profound exhaustion and the renewed sense of despair, helped, their inherent knowledge of the land proving invaluable. Wingyang Waste, her gaze focused and keen, pointed out a cluster of ancient gnarled cottonwood trees upstream, suggesting a possible calmer section where the river widened slightly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they found a passable ford, though it was still treacherous, its rocky bottom slippery and unseen. Elias, ever the leader, went first, testing the depth with his boot, his horse struggling against the powerful current. He guided them one by one, a painstaking, nerve-wracking process, his voice a steadying presence. When it was Sichangu Wingyang's turn, clutching the small, shivering Changte Wingyang tightly to her chest, the swift current suddenly surged, nearly sweeping her off her feet, her eyes wide with terror. Jed, seeing her desperate struggle and the immediate danger to the child, spurred his horse forward without a moment's hesitation, his usual stoic demeanor momentarily forgotten. He reached out a strong, calloused arm to steady her and the child, pulling them through the churning, icy water to solid ground. A silent, profound nod of acknowledgement, a brief but deeply significant exchange passed between him and Sichangu Wingyang. A small but undeniable crack in Jed's hardened, cynical exterior. Weeks had blurred into a lifetime since the storm had first brought them together, and the crushing weariness of the journey was now deeply etched on every face. Supplies were dangerously low, their bellies often rumbling with hunger, and the relentless cold had settled in with an unforgiving, biting grip, promising a harsh winter. Hope, once a vibrant flame, had dwindled to a flickering ember, threatening to extinguish completely beneath the weight of endless struggle. But then, one crisp, frigid morning, as Elias topped a wind-swept rise, his eyes, aching from constant scanning, finally caught it. A thin, almost ethereal plume of smoke curling lazily into the vast, indifferent sky in the far, far distance. It was faint, almost imperceptible against the muted hues of dawn, but it was unmistakably there. A sign of human habitation, a settlement. He pointed it out to Jed, a silent gesture, and then to Wingyang Waste, whose eyes widened in disbelief before a quiet exclamation of profound relief escaped her lips. A wave of renewed energy, raw and desperate, swept through the entire group, igniting a spark where there had been only weariness. Their pace quickened, spurred by the tantalizing promise of warmth, of food, of a fragile moment of safety. The terrain subtly shifted, becoming less wild, hinting at the encroaching presence of civilization. Fences, though old and broken, appeared sporadically, followed by the faint telltale tracks of wagons, barely visible in the hardened mud. As they drew closer, the faint plume of smoke thickened, carrying with it the comforting, earthy scent of burning wood, and mercifully, the savory aroma of cooking food. Elias could now clearly hear the distant, familiar barks of dogs, the lowing of unseen cattle, and the faint, indistinct murmur of human voices. The women, who had maintained their stoic composure throughout the arduous, seemingly endless journey, openly wept with unbridled relief, tears carving paths through the dust on their cheeks. Changte Wingyang, the child, who had been quiet and withdrawn for days, suddenly giggled, a bright, clear sound pointing a tiny finger at a startled rabbit that scurried across their path. A fleeting moment of pure, unadulterated joy. The sight of the small, struggling settlement, a cluster of log cabins and rough-hewn corrals, battered by the unforgiving elements but undeniably alive, filled Elias with an unexpected, almost overwhelming sense of accomplishment. They had made it. They had overcome the raw wilderness, wrestled with their own ingrained prejudices, and faced down the constant, gnawing threat of starvation and exposure. As they walked the final few hundred yards towards the cluster of weathered buildings, Elias glanced back at Jed. His partner, though still gruff and outwardly reserved, had a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. A rare sight. The silence that had once defined the space between them was no longer empty. It was now filled with the profound weight of shared experience, of a battle fought and won together. You're almost at the end of this incredible tale. Don't miss the powerful conclusion. Subscribe now and make sure you're notified when the final chapters drop. The arrival of the 2 dust-caked ranchers and 7 bedraggled Sioux women caused an immediate tense stir in the small, isolated settlement of Willow Creek. Settlers, their faces etched with suspicion and a raw curiosity, emerged from their sturdy log cabins, rifles held loosely but pointedly in their hands. The sight of the Sioux women, though clearly distressed and weary, ignited old, smouldering fears and deeply ingrained prejudices, stoked by years of conflict and misunderstanding. The town's elder, a grizzled, lean man named Silas, whose face was a roadmap of the harsh West, stepped forward, his eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Elias with an almost painful intensity. "What's the meaning of this, Elias?" he demanded, his voice low and firm, his gaze fixed pointedly on the women huddled behind the 2 ranchers. "Bringing them here?" Elias, bone-weary but resolute, his shoulders squared, explained their arduous journey, the broken wagon, the relentless storm, and the desperate circumstances that had brought these 2 disparate groups together. He vouched for the women, his voice steady despite the tension, emphasizing their peaceful nature and their dire need for aid. Jed surprisingly backed him up, his voice a terse but firm rumble. "They're good folks, Silas, been through hell, same as any of us." His unexpected support cut through some of the town's immediate hostility. Silas, after a long, tense silence that stretched the air taut, grudgingly agreed to allow the women temporary shelter in an unused, drafty shed at the edge of town, but with a clear, unequivocal warning. They were to stay there, out of sight, until arrangements could be made for them to move on. The townspeople, still wary, offered meager provisions, some old blankets, a few days' worth of flour and dried beans, their charity tempered by generations of ingrained wariness and fear. For Elias and Jed, the initial relief of finally reaching civilization was quickly mixed with a new, frustrating kind of tension. They were no longer just facing the untamed wilderness. They were now confronting the deep-seated mistrust and open prejudice that divided their worlds, a barrier perhaps even harder to break down than any mountain range. Elias spent the rest of the evening tirelessly trying to mediate, explaining the women's desperate plight to the skeptical settlers, trying to chip away at their ignorance. Jed, meanwhile, remained a silent, watchful presence, his rifle never far from his hand, a self-appointed guardian for those they had brought in from the storm. Days slowly blurred into a week of uneasy coexistence in Willow Creek. The Sioux women, gradually regaining strength from regular meals and dry shelter, remained largely isolated, a quiet boundary separating them from the townsfolk. Elias and Jed found themselves in an unexpected limbo. Their ranch was still a long journey away, and they carried a profound responsibility beyond simple charity. Elias spent hours talking with Wingyang Waste, listening as she haltingly explained her people's struggle for survival and their deep desire for peace. He understood their needs stretched beyond immediate aid. They desperately needed a safe place to rebuild, a future free from harassment. Eventually, word reached a nearby army outpost about the displaced Sioux group. A stern officer, Captain Miller, arrived, informing Wingyang Waste, through Elias's reluctant translation, that arrangements would be made for them to be escorted to a reservation further north. It wasn't the freedom they longed for, but Elias knew it offered, for now, safety and a temporary reprieve from constant threat. The morning of their departure was quiet and poignant. The women, dressed in simple clothes, gathered their few belongings. Wingyang Waste approached Elias and Jed, her eyes filled with deep gratitude. She spoke softly in her native tongue, then, placing a hand over her heart, conveyed with effort, "Thank you. For life. For help." Her voice was a fragile whisper carrying profound sincerity. Si Changu Wingyang, Changte Wingyang's mother, then presented Jed with a small, intricately beaded pouch, a silent token of deep appreciation. Jed, for the first time, looked genuinely uncomfortable, but he accepted it with a stiff nod, carefully placing it in his pocket. Changte Wingyang, the small child, reached out a tiny hand and, with a trusting gaze, gently touched Elias's weathered hand, a small gesture that resonated deeply within him. As the army escort led the Sioux women away, their figures shrinking until they vanished over the distant hills, Elias and Jed stood watching. They remained there until the last faint dust cloud settled and the vast horizon swallowed them whole. The familiar silence of the prairie returned, but it was profoundly different. No longer the empty, isolating quiet of their former lives, it was a space filled with the lingering echoes of shared hardship, unexpected compassion, and a powerful, almost reluctant connection forged in survival's crucible. They spent another day in Willow Creek, restocking supplies, their movements more purposeful, their conversations still sparse but subtly changed. Then, without much discussion, they turned their horses westward, back towards their isolated ranch, back to the familiar routines of cattle and fences. The journey home felt faster, lighter somehow, but the landscape itself seemed subtly altered. Every rock, every gnarled tree, every winding stream now held a fleeting memory of the women, of the desperate struggle, of the improbable alliance forged in the heart of a relentless storm. Jed, as was his way, remained mostly quiet throughout the journey, but Elias noticed him more than once, idly touching the small, intricately beaded pouch in his pocket, a tangible link to the extraordinary events. One evening, by their own campfire, Jed finally spoke, his voice gruff but tinged with something Elias hadn't heard before, a quiet sense of wonder. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered, staring deep into the flames. Elias nodded, understanding implicitly. Their lives, once so predictable and self-contained, had been irrevocably changed. They had faced their own fears, challenged their prejudices, and discovered a depth of humanity they hadn't known they possessed. The prairie wind still howled its ancient song, and days were still filled with demanding ranch work. But now, when Elias looked out at the vast, silent land, he saw not just empty expanse, but the lingering footprints of courage, resilience, and the fragile, powerful bonds that can form between strangers, even in the harshest corners of the world. Their silence was no longer a void, but a canvas upon which the vivid memories of 7 Sioux women were forever painted, a powerful reminder that true strength often lies not in solitude, but in the most unexpected connections. We hope you enjoyed 2 loner ranchers lived in silence until 7 Sioux women appeared at their campfire in the rain. If you were moved by this story, please consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful, realistic narratives like this one. Your support helps us bring more emotional and authentic stories to life.